So I have one mic, you guys have one mic to share, just so you know. So I'm going to signal you when because I heard we had some feedback. Yeah, we're looking forward to your feedback at the end of the panel. So Miriam, David, thank you for joining us for this conversation. I thought it would be interesting to help immerse our audience in this world of what the media environment in Alberta is right now, just by asking, what would you say most folks who aren't in the media world are missing about the big picture for Alberta media right now? Miriam, do you mind starting us off?
Sure. We're missing so much.
Unfortunately, we're missing so much right now with the current state of the media, not just here in Alberta, but right across the country. We're missing a lot of things. I think one of the most important things that we're missing is a diversity of voices and perspectives, and media organizations for that fact. It's probably not news to any of you that Canada has one of the worst problems with media concentration. The vast majority of the newspapers in this country are owned by one company, Postmedia, the one that I used to work for, which means that very often much of the content that you're seeing in newspapers, whether they're in Alberta, the Edmonton Journal and Calgary Herald, or if they're elsewhere in other provinces, in Ottawa and Montreal, for example, you're often seeing the same stories. And so we're missing that diversity. We're also missing, I think, representation. And in that I mean newsrooms that look like the communities they serve. It's probably, again, not going to be news to you that media in this country and in a lot of places in North America is dominated by white men who get to make the decisions, who are in the decision-making positions. There are some exceptions, but far and wide that is true, and I think as a result we're missing a diversity of perspectives and experiences in the news coverage that we actually get access to.
Now, I've been out of media for probably 15 years now, although I've been working with it from the other side, but I can tell you that I believe that everything that Miriam has said is true and bang on.
I like hearing that.
No, it's really true. But so the question was, what are you missing that you don't know that you're missing? And one of the impacts, or one of the effects of what Miriam's talking about is not just in terms of investigative reporting or major reporting about issues, but there's a lot of issues now that just aren't being covered, and you don't know it because it's not there. We used to have an expression that came from the Canadian press, when in doubt, leave it out, which is good advice. But when it's left out, you know, the backstory to that is that readers don't know that it was not that should have been covered. So not only are alternative views, as Miriam says, being ignored, but sometimes simply news that could be reported fairly neutrally is now not being covered because the financial position of the industry is so precarious. Maybe we'll talk more about why that is later. But newspapers tend to go and cover crime and car crashes, as I characterize it, and political commentary, because it's cheap and easy to do. It doesn't require a lot of research. It doesn't require a lot of bodies to do it. So you're missing a lot of news, for example, about things as simple and as non-political as amateur sports in your own community, or local news in your own community, simply because it's too expensive to do anything but cover the easy stuff. So the fundamental questions that Miriam has talked about are true, but the medium is also using, or the media is also using their financial position to cut back on the amount of news of all sorts that you're receiving.
One of the things that kills me about that trend of newsrooms covering more and more just crime and courtroom stuff is it feeds into this thing that I hear all the time, that people say that the news is too sad to tune into, and I feel like it becomes more just this like big weight the more of our media is focused on those kind of things. Well, the elephant in the room is Postmedia, I feel like, because
The elephant in the country.
the elephant in the country, yeah. Just in case by some chance you haven't seen how much they own now in Canadian media. They own basically the paper of record in every major English-speaking market in Canada, except for places like Surrey where they've closed them down. the Vancouver Sun, the Province, the Herald, the Calgary Sun, the Edmonton Sun, the Journal, the Regina Leader Post, the Saskatoon Star Phoenix, the Windsor Star, the Montreal Gazette, the Ottawa Citizen. That's not all, that's just part of the list. So we've got simultaneous problems of uber consolidation and massive cuts. Most of these papers have had big layoffs in the last year. So Miriam, do you mind starting off for this question? What is left in these newsrooms?
Not a lot. When I left the Journal, it was a couple months after the big round of layoffs that people might have heard of last year, early January. And even by then, we were at a very bare bones staff structure. And the result is, so firstly, there's fewer reporters, there are fewer, and with the fact that there are fewer reporters, it means that there are fewer people that you can actually assign to a beat. And beat work is how you get important news stories. That is how people develop sources and connections. They develop relationships. People begin to trust them with information, with leaks and that sort of thing. But when you don't have enough reporters to actually dedicate to different beats, you're going to lose all of that. And there's so many stories that you don't even know you're missing because you're not able to make those relationships happen because you have to dedicate the few reporter resources you have to general assignment, or maybe you're theoretically a health reporter, but you're doing 70% of the stuff is stories that they're just throwing at you because unfortunately it's all about feeding that daily news beast, and there's not enough time to actually give attention and resources to those stories that take a little bit of time to develop, that take the research, the FOIP filings, that kind of thing. There's also far fewer editors, and I think that we're probably seeing evidence of this in, and I mean copy editors and proofreaders and stuff, and you see that in the quality of the stories that are released, and the kinds of stories that get published as well. And we're also seeing, of course, for example, the Journal outsourced its printing and closed down its printing press a few years ago. It's just completely a shell. It's not even trimming fat, it's not meat, it's like down to the bone, and now they're shaving, it's just awful. And that's happening right across the country. Last year, during those big layoffs, they laid off 90 people across the country, and a good 30 of them were in Edmonton. I think more than 30, in fact. And so that's a devastating blow to a news organization, and it means that there's more work for fewer people. And so you're working even more, but at the same time, they're cutting, benefits and that sort of thing, and changing, the pension scheme, and taking away, just recently, they took away the maternity leave top-up benefit, that kind of thing. So what's left in these newsrooms is not enough, which makes the people who are left there more stressed out. They have to do even more work. They have to, write three. I mean, it was not uncommon for me to write 3 stories a day, for example. And then at the same time, you're taking away benefits and things from people at their most stressed, when they're the most overworked. And so I think that is a really, really unfortunate aspect of this, because we all know how important it is for media in our country in order to have a strong democracy, in order to have transparency. And I think that we're all losing as a result, regardless of what your position is on any issue.
Just a couple terms that I noticed that folks in the room might not be familiar with. When we talk about beat reporting, we're talking about covering an issue consistently over time. So, for example, like one of your beats was the legislature, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Beat reporting. In Alberta, there used to be a beat called the Labour Beat that stopped existing like 20 years ago because, again, the resources, that cutting was happening from a long time ago, of course.
I can tell you with great confidence it was more than 20 years ago. I was the Labour reporter to the Calgary Herald, and I believe I was the last one in Alberta, and it would have been more than that. Now, Miriam, how many people in the newsroom when you left?
Probably altogether about 40,
Okay. Well,
and that's like everyone. I mean, editors, the few layout people, reporters, the people who are, or the few photographers that were left.
Right, so this is very useful, because when I left the Calgary Herald, or when I was at the Calgary Herald, there were about 220 people on the same list, so paper about the same size and a similar size of community. So, and this was before, the figure Miriam cited of 40 was before the last round of cutbacks. So you can see the kind of impact it's had on staffing. I agree with Miriam also that the degrading of the beat system is part of the problem with journalism now and part of people's hostility to it. Although I also think that that was not really driven by, that was driven by bad management decisions. Because this seemed like an easy way to save money, just as cutting editors was. So Postmedia, as I understand it, has consolidated most of their editing functions in Hamilton, Ontario. So you just won't know in Hamilton if you're editing something about, if somebody writes Prince Albert and they mean St. Albert, they're not necessarily going to pick up on the difference. So the kinds of mistakes can creep in because of that. But another aspect of this has been that the shortage of people has made journalists more and more heavily dependent on press releases. And press releases come from organizations that can afford to produce them. And the outcome of that is that the news you're reading, I think, is incrementally all the time a little more spun by professionals who are good at that.
Including some folks in this room. Keep up your good work getting your messages out there. It's just up to us on the other side to do our job reporting on it well. So, I mean, I helped set up this premise that, you know, this post-media environment is a big part of our media landscape in Alberta, but there are a lot of other elements in our media ecosystem. I work in community radio at CJSR. There are 3 community radio stations in the province. We've got CKUA, we've got CBC's TV, online radio, we've got, you know, the Metro newspapers, The Rebel. There are lots of politics podcasts out there in the province. There's Press Progress, there's your own blog, there's Dave Cornoy's blog. David, do you mind starting with this one? Why are the post-media papers eating up so much of our attention when we think about the media landscape in this province? How significant are they really to that landscape?
Well, they're very significant for a couple of reasons, but I do think that even if you have 40 reporters or 20 reporters, you're still at a significant advantage over someone like me or like Dave. Now, I just write commentary. I occasionally cover news, but not very often, so that's an easier thing to do. But you need a certain number of people in order to be able to cover all the stories in the city consistently. Miriam talked about sometimes writing 3 stories a day, and we've all had that experience at different times. But when you're covering 3 stories a day, you're not covering them in depth. You're not doing the research that the report really deserves. So post-media partly remains important because it's still bigger than everybody else on the block. Even though the problem they have is not their size, it's that the print media in particular, but the traditional media business model is broken. And there's a variety of reasons for that, and it's not as simple as saying it's the internet, but certainly the internet is part of it. And that means when you had a system where you couldn't not make money for 100 years, and you made decisions on the basis that the money was always going to flow in, it's a bit like being a union and having the RAND formula go away. They don't know how to cope with the situation they now face and continue to make money. So that's why I think that post-media is in such danger and why they continue to cut. But for the moment, they're still a major player. And they can still do more than bloggers like myself could do, because I try only to cover 1 story a day. I don't know if that answers completely what you were after, but.
I think it matters because, I mean, these are the papers of record like you talked about in almost every city. I think the Winnipeg Free Press is the only one, especially in Western Canada. And so they're still, like David said, they're the big player. They're the big guy on the block. They still, they can swing their weight around, right? When a reporter from one of those papers calls up, there's something to it when they say I'm calling from the Journal or the Herald. It gets them access, it gets them a bit of respect, or maybe a phone hung up in your face depending on who the person is, but like, they matter still, and I think that's, and people are turning to those papers. And I think also, I think people have just seen such a decline, and we know what a newspaper can be, and we see what's happening here. And I think, and we see, really good reporters who are either being laid off or who are not able to do the kinds of stories they set out to do when they started out in the business, because you're feeding you're feeding the Daily News Beast and you're getting press releases flipped your way and you've got to write it up and turn it around because you got to put out a paper and there's only 5 people today to do that, so how are you going to do it? You're going to just write press releases.
I just want to add to that, when you see what Miriam was talking about, the newspapers, employers cutting benefits, cutting maternity benefits, making people's jobs insecure, what happens? The good people leave, the people with options. And so you're left with a less experienced, lower quality workforce there too, so the quality of the work declines over time.
It's interesting you're talking about that effect of making a phone call and people sort of sitting up straight when they hear that it's someone they know calling, because Postmedia has this campaign now, the Built on Trust campaign. Have you guys seen these ads? Talking about how in an environment of fake news and alternative facts, Postmedia papers have been there for you for X number of years, depending on the market, and you can trust them. But you know, we are all shouting fake news at each other right now. Who is responsible for the breakdown of trust that's happening right now in North America between the media and the public?
That's a tough question.
Write a PhD dissertation on that question. Actually, someone should go do that. Who is responsible? Well, I think it's a confluence of different events and people. I think cynical politicians help to feed it, and I think, of course, also the fact that there's so many things. I think one of the big problems that happened in the past few years was the Competition Bureau's decision to allow Paul Godfrey's business proposal to go through, and for the Sun and the Journal to sort of all merge under the one big Postmedia event. I mean, that's completely opposite of competition, but I mean, I guess they've decided that's not what they do anymore at the Competition Bureau. But that decision really, I think, was a kind of a death knell for papers. I think, unfortunately, they're going to collapse now under the weight of this bad deal that was approved, because we're seeing Paul Godfrey completely gut the broadsheet newsrooms in the way that they did with the Sun organization. And so, I think that there's a lot of reasons why that happened, and I think there's bad management decisions have been happening for years as well. And I think there's one other thing that happened too recently, and I think this has sort of fed into people's distrust a little bit of the paper one way or the other, or the papers, was when Godfrey mandated that every newspaper in the country under his direction publish a front page endorsement of the Conservatives during the election. That really, I think, left people with a really bad taste in their mouths, given the kind of decisions that he'd been making at the papers even before that.
I just want to preface this by saying that I think that what they should do for an advertising campaign is adopt the workplace safety model. So instead of saying, you can only trust us, everyone else has fake news, they should say something along the lines of, we've now reported for 27 days without fake news.
You can have that on the front page of the paper every day.
Concentration of ownership is certainly part of the distrust problem, but I do want to say something in defense of my former colleagues who are still in the news business, that I don't think that Postmedia, or what I critically call mainstream media, are really responsible for what we normally mean by the phrase fake news. I mean, I think people who still work there try to cover stories properly and are covering real news. If there's a problem in Postmedia, it's not fake news, it's spun news. And spin is different. Spin is when you're not covering part of the story but not all of the story. You're ignoring facts or suppressing facts or trying to make it look good and take an overtly political position in your news coverage. Traditionally, that was seen as not a good thing to do. There's more and more of it. People distrust the news and they feel uncomfortable with it, but they don't really know what it is that makes them uncomfortable. Earlier on, we were talking about covering crime news, and I'm sorry, I can't really cite this chapter and verse, but there was research done many years ago between new attitudes toward crime that people had in Toronto and in Amsterdam. And the crime rates in those cities at the time were roughly comparable. But people who lived in Amsterdam thought they were much safer because the press in the Netherlands covered heavy major political issues and didn't really bother with crime stuff. And the press in Toronto covered crime heavily. And so as a consequence, people felt more threatened because of the relationship with the kind of media they had in their communities. So I think you can have factors in the way things are being covered that readers or viewers don't really understand or realize, but they sense that something's wrong. And that gives to an attitude of distrust.
And I think too, obviously, I think it goes without saying that we just live in an age where there's so much information available to us. And the job, I think, of a good news organization is to cut through all the noise and give you what you need. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is they're giving us noise and what we need, and then you can't really see what you need because there's so much noise. That they're trying to be everything to everyone, and I think we'd see more success if papers really focused on doing what they do well. So if you're in Edmonton and you're a big daily newspaper here, focus on the provincial legislature, focus on the city council, do what you do best and let everyone else do the rest. I think is a good idea because you can't be everything to everyone anymore. There's not enough resources around for that to begin with. And so trying to do that, giving up that sort of fake guise of we can still do it all, we're putting out a paper, here you go, you've got all the story. But as David said, you don't know what you're missing. And if they would focus on things that they could do really well, I think we'd all benefit, we'd all be for the better in that case.
But we all know that organizations and our labor movement is like this too. Continues to make mistakes over and over again because we say, well, we've been making the same mistake for 75 years now, let's do the same thing again next year. And newspapers are like that. They've had a tradition of bad management because it was so hard not to make money. So they did things that way, and it takes courage to say, well, you know what, we're only going to cover the legislature and we're only going to cover City Hall. That's a great idea, they should do it, but it would be hard for them to do it. There'd be a lot of people put up their hands internally and said, we've never done that before, you'll be in big trouble.
I think Jesse Brown, that was a Catalan, his suggestion for CBC's future was really interesting, that they should just focus on news, just cut out all the entertainment stuff. But I think there are going to be some big structural changes ahead. Do you want to expand more on that point about cynical politicians exploiting that attitude of mistrust? Because I think just reading about Senator Lynn Beyak this week, it's like reality is outpacing parody. There was a great Beaverton article earlier this week talking about, the real thing that happened in the Senate was that said that residential schools were not so bad during a speech that was ostensibly about something completely different. But then the Beaverton published an article saying that she was demanding an apology from residential school survivors for all the trauma they'd caused her. And then yesterday, she was presented with more stories about residential school survivors, and she responded by saying that there should be more tax audits on reserves. Do you mind just expanding on that idea? Because her response to all this has been, it's fake news.
Yeah, I hate that term, fake news. I wish everyone would stop using it because it's been completely co-opted by the people we're talking about when we say fake news. And now anyone who disagrees with a position that is completely correct, factual, whatever you want to call it, they just turn around and they say it's fake news. Well, you're writing a story that is critical of, the party that I support, therefore it's fake news. I think we should just retire it, put it away, burn it. I don't like it. I think it's not doing any purposes for us anymore at all. I did not think that was the thing that was going to get the room full of applause, but awesome. I'm glad everyone is on board with my campaign for ending the term fake news. I think that we can all look very clearly at a couple of outfits that exist in our province that are peddling in the business of news articles that are masquerading as something that is true, something that is objective. Namely the Rebel, I think, and I think that we're seeing some really cynical, unscrupulous politicians completely use that to their advantage to shore up support for themselves. We're seeing federal conservative leadership candidates do it, and we're seeing members of opposition parties here in Alberta do it. And they're completely feeding into this idea that anything that's coming out of a news organization that isn't all the way to the right and completely bad. I'm not going to say what I really want to say. They're just completely feeding into that idea, and so they're, you know, when someone sees a politician standing up with or with someone who's running this kind of an outfit or on one of their shows or quoted in an article, they're giving it legitimacy. And they're bolstering its reputation. And unfortunately, I think another thing that's really been lacking in Canada, and not just in recent years, but for quite a long time, is that there is a real lacking in media literacy out there, and I think that's part of the problem as well. People lack the skills to look at a news article and question it critically and say, what's missing from this? Why is this being presented the way it's being presented? You know, people read something and they think, whoa, wow, I can't believe that, and they carry on. They post it on Facebook, it proliferates, and they carry on, all the while it's completely fabricated or has been completely misrepresented because it's been posted on some website that has a clear agenda, if you spend a minute or two digging through the couple of links that are available to you. And so I think those factors, coupled together, have really allowed for this proliferation of fake news.
I just want to say something in defense of the term fake news.
They already adopted my campaign, you can't.
Well, we can ask for a reconsideration. It's never been easier, and this is one impact of what the internet has done. It's never been easier to produce, let's say, fake information. Whether you're pretending to put out news, or whether you're pretending to sell stocks, or whether you're pretending to advocate a position on climate change. It doesn't take much to create an institution when all you really have to do now is create a nice looking website. So that's part of the problem with fake news. But I agree with you, Miriam, that the term is being used widely to describe stories that I disagree with or spin that I am uncomfortable with. And I want to say there's a story today that many newspapers that have always run April Fool's stories are not going to be running them tomorrow because they're afraid of being accused of fake news. I personally think that's a real tragedy.
I hate the April Fool's Day stories too, so I'm fine with it.
We'll discuss that after.
I feel like some of this is the downside of Squarespace and other online platforms being so easy to use. It's just really easy to make a website that looks very similar to something credible.
Yes.
Yeah. So, what's next, David?
Yeah, you can take this.
What's next in terms of the media landscape? I predict within the next 2 years that post-media will fail. And then that will change the landscape in significant ways. That's if the question's what's next. If the question's what should be next, I have a slightly different spin to put on that. But in terms of post-media, I really think in an ironic way, that company is being better managed now than it has been for a number of years, but it's not being managed to succeed. It's being managed to squeeze blood from the stone so that the owners can get all the assets out of it as quickly as possible. And at that point, and this was my really too mean April Fool's joke, was to go down to the Edmonton Journal building on April Fool's and put a chain on the door and a sign saying, meet over in the hotel across the street. I couldn't do that because people there would believe that it was true. Anyway, April Fool's was on a Saturday this year, so. So I think the change in the media landscape is going to be the loss of this big newspaper chain. Does that mean those papers will go away? I don't know, and I hope not. I hope there'll be a way to reestablish those assets and those brands in the community by business people who want to run papers better. But I don't know that. It might be the end of it. So how do we replace that? And I'll be quick on this, but we need, as progressive people and as institutions, as progressive institutions, to think about ways to establish news sources that practice real journalism, not just propaganda, but real journalism, as a kind of lost leader for our editorial position, just like business people used to do when they ran newspapers. And now it's cheaper than ever to do that. We can do it through news sites. And I really think that the Tyee, while imperfect, is a good model of how that can work in British Columbia. And it's troubled me that for many years in Alberta, we've taken some of the money that pours into our progressive organizations like labor unions and used it for a lot of things, but not used it to create an alternative news source that would attract people to it because it covered the news well and covered the important stuff in the community well, but also provide us with a platform at which we could talk about issues that were important to us and do a bit of that news spin our way. Now, that does cost some money. I think I costed it out about 7 years ago that you'd need subsidies to run a reasonably good paper that had some online paper, right? That's not the wrong term, but I'm an old-fashioned guy. You'd need about $500,000 a year. We could afford that if we decided that we wanted to do that.
Yeah, I agree that I think in terms of the post-media sort of question, I think that it's going to fail within the next couple of years. I think that's an inevitability, and I think it is a big question mark about what happens after that if local interests try to buy up the papers individually. I think it is going to be devastating, though, for all of those community newspapers in rural areas that are now owned by the same company. I mean, if you think about almost every single newspaper in this province is owned by the same company, and that goes from, you know, Fort McMurray Today down to the Herald, like, and all the small papers in between. And so I think it will be, unfortunately, quite devastating for those communities that rely on those newspapers for their local news, because they're already operating like with 1 or 2 staff, publishing a couple times a week, and I think they're unlikely to survive a collapse like that, and I don't know how they'll be able to resurrect themselves or if it will take someone resurrecting them.
So the damage there isn't the disappearance of the physical paper that you get around town, because that could be created online or some other way. The damage is the loss of the people who care about news, who have some skills covering news, who are in the community, who have to make a living and will have to make a living doing something else. So it's just like what's been happening in post-media. It's the loss of your human resources that do the most damage.
There are some projects being started by people from that ecosystem already, like the broadcast, Women in Politics podcast has been started by Tricia S. Brooks and
Alex Zabchek, who was also at the Journal.
And Liz Nichols has launched her own website as well for arts coverage. She used to do arts coverage for Journal, she's an institution. Is that a good model to be thinking of all these people with experience starting their own online initiatives?
I think they're smartly using the sort of reputation and capital that they built for themselves during their careers. But those are very niche sort of topics, like they're very specific and focused. And so it's not a solution. I mean, it's not a broad solution in any event. It's, you know, the broadcast is talking about women in politics, which is an excellent topic and one that deserves lots of attention because there hasn't been enough attention on it, I think. Liz Nichols is, as you say, a theater institution, and so she's going to have no trouble sort of attracting eyes to that endeavor because she's built a reputation for herself. That doesn't solve the sort of more broad news problem. It's a lot more difficult, I think, to launch something that is more broad, and perhaps that isn't the answer. I think the thing here is that so much of this is a question mark. We don't know what's going to work, what's going to sprout up in sort of the aftermath. You know, I'd love to see a website that pops up that focuses exclusively on city council and really focuses on the issues and really does some digging, because we haven't seen a lot of really investigative work coming out of Edmonton City Council, for example. That kind of stuff I think there's room for. But again, I think there's just such a big question about how people will react to this, and I think we have to wait for it all to sort of explode before we can see what comes out of it.
Yeah, I would say something to bear in mind is that it costs more to do good reporting than it costs to do good commentary. You can have a thoughtful commentator who writes about the theater, for example, who understands the theater and can write excellent stuff based on her knowledge. But if she's going to turn to real reporting, whether it's news reporting or in-depth investigative reporting, it takes time, it takes a lot of calls to people, it takes some real research, it may take freedom of information searches. So the costs are higher. So the niche idea is a good one in terms of general fields, but you still, while you have to focus some, you still have to have the revenue to pay people to do that work. And something I forgot to say before, so I want to say it now, is that if we persuade a progressive institution to do this, they have to be really brave, because what they have to do is they have to agree to let journalists be journalists. And that's hard, because then the journalists are not always going to write what you want. So you have to say, as the BC Federation of Labour did with the TIE, that we're willing to admit that some of the stories they write will be stories we don't like. But we and the society we believe in are going to gain some, on average, a lot because of this enterprise. And so you've really got, that takes courage, because you'll have members who come to you and say, we should stop giving money to that bunch of clowns because we didn't like that last story. And that's hard in democratic organizations to deal with.
All right, I want to ask you guys one more question before we get to some audience questions. For folks in the audience who want to support a strong media arm of our democracy, what is one piece of homework that you would give them today? Dave or Mary, yeah.
You start, Dave.
Well, we know it takes money, and we know that some of our progressive institutions have money. Trade unions are good examples. So you need to speak to trade union leaders and say, this is a priority for me. It's like any other kind of political lobbying that you do. So the thing I would say to you is, if you don't care about this issue, then don't say anything about it, because you have other priorities, and that's fair and that's reasonable in a democracy. But if you think this is a real gap in our society and you think strongly it has to be remedied, speak up to the people who are in a position to make the decisions to remedy it.
I guess on a more sort of small scale level, don't be afraid to like write letters to the editor and do stuff like that. Engage with the media that you have access to. And I will say, speaking as a former reporter who, the other thing about reporting right now sucks is that you're under-resourced, you're overburdened, and then like so many people just hate you anyway because you're a reporter. And so it opens you up to all sorts of mean emails and nasty tweets and stuff. So if there's a reporter out there whose work you respect and admire, tell them. No one ever gets those emails where they're like, that was a really important story, I appreciate the work you put into it. That doesn't happen. It is like so nice when it actually does happen. It gives you that little boost, and like there's so few of those boosts these days. If there's a reporter whose work you respect, let them know.
I have one more thing to say about that, but I did most of my reporting in the era before email, so if people wanted to abuse you, you had to phone them up and you could just say, I'm not listening to this garbage, and hang on. I'm going to just pass the mic on. I made a note to myself here. I know what it was. I was having trouble reading my own writing. What Miriam suggests, phoning reporters up, though, if you have a legitimate complaint, and you want to and I would advise you to do this in a respectful, in helpful and positive way, but you can get results. And one area that I want to talk to you about that I've had good results with is, I won't let it pass now when somebody refers in a headline or in a story to a union boss. And I phone the reporters and I tell them, look, this is a pejorative term. It's designed to make unions appear less credible to their members and others. And I am personally offended. Our leaders are elected people. They're not bosses in a profound and important sense. And what's startling about this to me is that the incredible success I've had with this. Because when I phone people, and I try not to be abusive to them, I've had them say, in one case I had a reporter who shall remain unnamed for a major publication not owned by Postmedia say, oh, I'm so sorry, I'd never thought of that. And then within half an hour it was gone and had been replaced by a union leader or a union president. And I've had particularly good success with the CBC. They do it consistently. And when they do it, I phone them or I put it on their correction thing, and they often fix it within about half an hour to an hour. So.
I think David and I had an interaction like that way back when I was a Green reporter. He was a little bit, but that's okay, I put him in his place. But I will also say, just to add to that, if you think that there's a story that needs to be told, or if you read a story that you think is missing an angle, like again I say, there's so few reporters out there doing so much work, like let them know. They might not have known that. They legitimately just might have missed the angle by virtue of the fact that they have lots of things to do and lots of people are trying to chase down, and the work is just more and more difficult these days. And so, call them up and say, hey, I read this story, it was really great, have you considered looking at this, try this source. Nothing is stopping you from doing it, and I will tell you that the sort of response to those kinds of emails is pretty positive generally. And I always used to appreciate it when someone who maybe had more expertise in something than I did would contact me and share that expertise with me so that more people can benefit from it. And then you write a follow-up story, or you dig a little more and you find out, hey, whoa, this angle like is really important and I'm gonna write a series of stories on it. Engage with your media if you care about the kinds of stories you're getting.
I wholeheartedly agree. All right, so we're gonna move on to some questions now. We have two wonderful runners, so we'll be looking for your hands and we'll be indicating to them that you have a question. Sahar, would you mind, we've got someone at the back with a question on that side? And just, can you let us know who your question is for and your name?
Hi, Nicolette, kind of both, whoever wants to answer. I was just wondering if you could kind of explain to us the tangible effects of the loss of the Fourth Estate in Canada's democracy, especially with the shrinking journals and as well as like the lack of media literacy.
Well, I mean, we all know that to have a good, thriving, strong democracy, you need a free press that is going to shed light on issues of great importance, and for the most part, I believe that that comes out of political arenas, so not exclusively, but I think a lot of it does. And with the breakdown of media organizations, as I say, there's fewer people to do the work, fewer resources to invest in that work. So you're going to see fewer freedom of information requests being filed, which really yield the most important stories because that's where government sort of buries things that they don't want you to know about. And so you're not getting access to the kinds of stories that really shake a government's core, really. That remind them that they're responsible to people and that the media can be a really important conduit for sort of sparking that interest, I guess, in the electorate.
Can you give an example of a story that was generated by FOIP? The Sky Palace story came out because of FOIP requests, right?
Yes and no, it was kind of a combination of things. It was also just a lot of shoe leather reporting and constantly questioning the Premier's office as well. A lot of it did come out through FOIP. One big example I think that people will probably remember is the Edmonton Journal's recent Fatal Care project that looked at deaths of children in care, in provincial care. That was well, first of all, that was a FOIP that was filed years and years ago. You know, many years before the project ever came to fruition, and then it was also the result of 6 months straight of beat reporters being pulled off of their beat and putting on the investigation. That so rarely happens now, and in fact, I doubt that we would see something to that scale happen again at these newspapers because there's just no desire to really devote that kind of resource to those kinds of investigations. You know, no one's willing to take a reporter off of general assignment stories or even perhaps their beat. There are a few beats left to focus on an investigation that is expensive, and so people are not willing to do it.
I want to preface this by saying, once again, we're too agreeable, but I agree with most of what Miriam's saying. But I do, in the theoretical sense, but I do want to raise a red flag for you on this that you should be concerned about, because for a long time, and some papers know, the Journal was always a better paper than the Herald, and I say that as someone who worked for the Herald, not the Journal, and always a fairer paper in my view. But starting in the late 1990s, the Herald really began to spin their news hard. And continued to do that. So the question is, well, what kind of impact would the disappearance of these institutions have on the health of democracy? Not as much as people make it sound like, because they haven't been doing their jobs in many cases properly for an awfully long time. And so I want to move from there to this issue that we've been hearing lately, these arguments which are true, so it's not fake news, but presented as if, well, without these institutions, democracy is doomed, which I don't think is true, so we better give huge tax breaks or outright subsidies to new media that is already not doing their job properly. And I think that as citizens we should be suspicious of that. I don't think personally that it's a good idea to subsidize Postmedia, because Postmedia will continue to pocket the profits and operate in the way they already are. And they'll continue to cut their reporting staffs to the bone, and we won't see and the democratic improvement that we're hoping for from doing that. So as a caution to you, while what is being said here is true, the solution isn't necessarily to put our tax money or either directly or indirectly through tax breaks back to the newspaper business.
Thank you for your question. All right, next question. I think I saw your hand up pretty quick there. Yeah, in the middle here. Hi, yeah, just keep waving your hand and the lead will come to you.
I'm just curious from the panelists what their top 3 news sources in Canada would be.
Great, and your name?
My name is Peter Adamski.
Great, thanks.
I'm less of a news source follower and more of a reporter whose work I like and trust follower, I guess you could say. And I would really just encourage you to do it that way, is to find a reporter whose work interests you, whose work you trust, who seems ethical and who's providing you with good, solid reporting. And there's lots of folks. I think I will also say though that the Toronto Star, while it is a Toronto paper, does a lot of really good reporting. They have folks who are on beats that don't exist at other papers anymore, and I do appreciate that. You know, you see people who do social justice writing, for example, and that kind of thing, and that doesn't really exist at other papers. So I do appreciate that about the Toronto Star as well.
Okay, well, I have a couple of lists here, but I immediately through my first list said actually had 4 on it, but it said the Toronto Globe and Mail, because I used to work there and I know people and I think it's a fine newspaper. The Toronto Star, for the same reasons Miriam just said. The New York Times, even though it's not a Canadian newspaper, and even though it does spin some stories, it's a respectable news story. And I'm sorry this will be controversial, but RT, Russia Today, which I think is an excellent news service, and I look at every day. It's not fake news, but it is spun news. But you have to be media literate to understand what the spin is, just as you do at the New York Times. Here in town, I still read the Edmonton Journal, and as Miriam can attest, many of her stories were the source of my commentary. And I like the local CBC for news coverage, but I don't find CBC seems not to know how to do opinion, and as a consequence, the opinion they do isn't very good.
I admit I am shocked to hear that RT is on your list. Yeah, I mean they're spin, but they're like hard, almost malevolent spin to me.
Well, the other thing I have to say about them is they've got a great, RT has a great iPhone app that actually works properly because it's not graphic heavy. So.
I think that it's useful sometimes to read that kind of publication, like RT, for example, to know what the positions of the backers are, right? Like that's it. I think it's useful for that purpose, not because you're reading it and you're saying, oh, okay, this is what's going on in the world today. This is what they want to push, and I think that's useful information.
All right, another question. Oh, hello.
My name is Jenna. You mentioned that there is this lack of media literacy, so I'm wondering what we can do to kind of combat that, and kind of suggestions of like where does that responsibility fall, and what does that look like to try and encourage people to think more critically about what they're reading.
Who do you want to field your question?
To all.
Well, I guess you could introduce some curriculum into for the Department of Education to high school classes to talk about media literacy. That would be a valuable contribution, but no government could do that without being accused of awful crimes of trying to indoctrinate young people, particularly the current one. But that's a very good question, and it's a very hard one to answer. What do you do to encourage media literacy when the media landscape discourages media literacy and is designed to? So, like I say, education, education, and education, but I think the chances of making that happen are not very great. I'll save this other topic for later.
Yeah, I think it's tough. That's a tough thing to sort of fix or alleviate. I do also sort of think that the best solution would be one in which children in schools are given some kind of media literacy. I didn't go to elementary or junior high or anything here in Alberta, so I don't know what it's like here. I went to school in Ontario, and we didn't have anything really like that. In high school, we had a sort of civic literacy course that was worth half a credit, and you sort of learned about, you know, a legislature and city council and political parties and that kind of thing, but there wasn't, and that was like a new course that had been introduced when I was in high school. And I actually think if there were going to be some sort of curriculum that talked about media and civic literacy and that sort of thing, that it would have to start before high school. I think high school's too late for that. I think it should start at junior high. You know, I think we should give kids credit, and I think it's better if they're given sort of access to that kind of stuff at a younger age. So they're more likely to develop a stronger media literacy on their own as well.
I got some ideas for that. I mean, I would say one of the best ways is learn how reporting is done. I happen to work at CJSR. We're a community radio station. We are always looking for people to come learn how to make radio. That's one outlet. Listening to Canadaland is a super easy, fun addition to your week. It's a media criticism podcast and often really sassy commentary about news stories, so that's great. Also, there's this excellent podcast made in the US called How Sound. They call it the backstory to great radio storytelling, but many of the episodes focus on how reporters do their work, so I think How Sound is an excellent resource as well.
I could really just have.
So at the Journal, before Alexandra Zabchak was laid off last year, she was doing a sort of regular feature. The name of it escapes me now, but essentially the premise was, whoa, this was a really big story in our paper and it got a lot of readership, so how did you get that story? And it was basically a story about how the story came to be, and I think news organizations, I think, would be well served to sort of let people in a little bit to see actually how news is gathered, because I do think that sometimes, you know, the kinds of questions I would get from my friends when I became a reporter it demonstrated to me that people really, it's a big kind of mystery, like, oh, the newsroom, how does it work? It's like, I pick up a phone and I call someone and I keep calling someone until they talk to me and I just ask them lots of questions, like, that's how it happens. It's not some big mystery, and so I think news organizations would do well to let people in a little bit and sort of, yeah.
I always thought being a reporter was a great job to explain to your kids, because all you have to say is, well, I go and listen to what people say, I write it down and I put it in the newspaper. So like being a police officer, you know, I catch crooks and put them in jail.
Yeah, and there are plenty of Edmonton reporters who are pretty responsive online, like Elise Stolte is constantly looking for ideas for current stories that she's working on, so if you follow her on Facebook, that's a great way to learn about how reporting is done too.
Yeah.
Great question, thank you.
Ray Cash had a question in the corner for.
Excellent. Aaliyah, do you mind? Can we make you jog farther?
Well, I went to the back this time because I thought you were going to go for second.
It's like tennis.
Thanks for teaching us so much today. So my question starts with a statement that I know that there's a deep lack of coverage of rural Indigenous communities and governance by Indigenous reporters. And I'm wondering how you feel this issue impacts access to democracy and justice for Indigenous communities in Canada, and what can be done to alleviate that. And I guess also whose responsibility that is.
Who do you want to direct your question to?
Everybody.
The hard part of the question is who you direct the responsibility to. I mean, actually the solution, I think, is the impact is real, because look, if you're someone like me who is a white male of a certain age who was raised with certain attitudes in a certain community, no matter how good my will is, I am not. It's more difficult for me to see the world through someone else's eyes. So I need the help of Indigenous reporters, as well as Indigenous people needing the help of Indigenous reporters to make their views public. So the solution's easy theoretically. It's hire more people who see the world that way. But who is responsible when the organizations that are doing the hiring now are in chaos because of the problems with their business model? One thing I think we can and we should do is press our national government to continue to support the CBC and to ensure that people with from a variety of backgrounds are employed as reporters in the CBC. That's a practical step we can take. But it is a tough question.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think firstly, the APTN does really, really good work. There's so much news that comes out of that organization. I think also that, echoing David, the CBC is far and ahead of everybody else in the game in terms of the kinds of reporting that we see that actually goes into those communities, that actually has a presence in the north, for example. And I think that we need to do everything we can to protect the CBC and ensure that it remains funded appropriately and its mandate is kept so that it has to be responsive to those kinds of issues, that it has to be representative of those kinds of issues. I think in the current sort of landscape that we exist in, the CBC is a really important player in that realm. And I think it also just goes back to, again, echoing David, what I said at the beginning, which is a newsroom and a news organization cannot serve the community that it's meant to serve if the people working at it don't represent it, if there are not a diversity of voices and experiences and kinds of people to actually do that work. And unfortunately right now that is not the case. You know, at the taking away from it the sort of race issues and that and looking at gender, at the Edmonton Journal we were one of the exceptions in terms of this white male rule. It was still overwhelmingly white, but there were a lot of women in positions of leadership, and they were, of course, the first two women to get axed when those layoffs came down, Margot Goodhand and Stephanie, oh my God, why is her, Stephanie Coombs, really strong newswomen who stood up to Paul Godfrey. Margot went out and publicly talked about the fact that they were forced to put those endorsements on the front of the paper, and her reward was to get sacked in the most unceremonious way, you know, in a hotel, 30 minutes south of the newsroom. So for me, that was a really clear sign that it wasn't about ethics and principles and standing up for your convictions. It was about, well, you're pushing back and we're going to get rid of you. And that didn't feel like a safe organization for someone like me to exist in. And that's the opposite direction that we should be moving in today. Because of course, who replaced them? Men. And in the Journal it was a white man. And so, for me that was a really, that was a red flag. And I think we're really doing a disservice to our communities because they deserve so much better than this.
I think one thing that I would add to that is there are lots of media organizations in Canada ready to take on more people if they can get a little bit of funding to make it happen, and there are lots of organizations that could use a little bit of funding from probably some of the organizations you work for to fund fellowships and internships. That gives young Indigenous reporters the chance to get started in the field, and then once they have that foot in the door, there are lots of connections you can make. So that's one thing you can do with your organization is fund a fellowship.
That's a great idea.
Okay, another question from this side of the room. Jerry, we got a question up there.
You guys have been all talking around this a little bit, but I wonder if you can zero in on the aspect. Part of the premise that I'm hearing is the death of newspapers equals the death of journalism, and I don't think that's true. But I know you've talked a little bit about other media, but I wonder if you can talk a little bit about whether news in other media is replacing newspapers. And I'd like Miriam to start this one because you're young, and David's young at heart, but he also does different media, i.e. the blog in particular. So I'd like to hear those two different perspectives.
Great, and I think this is our last question. Miriam.
I think, unfortunately, we're still seeing the kinds of cuts. Obviously, they're not happening as quickly and as sharply and as horribly as they're happening at newspapers. But we're still seeing big cuts at magazines, at television news stations, and at radio stations. Right? I think at this point, no one's safe. Now, I don't think that the sort of declining business state of news, be it newspapers or television news, it means the death of journalism. I think people are always going to need access to news. I think it's going to be, the problem though is that quality, in-depth journalism is difficult, as David's pointed out, is difficult to do without the time and the money to allow you to do it. And that's why we see it traditionally having come out of organizations that have the money and the resources to do that kind of work. And so I don't know what's going to happen. I think though we are going to see a failure and things are going to continue to decline, and that failure is going to force some more creative out of the box thinking, because that legacy will sort of have gone and crashed and burned, and there will be that sort of freedom, that movement to be able to sort of build something that's a little bit more novel and innovative on it, is my hope.
See, I'm not only an old guy, I'm an old print guy, so I tend to use the language of print to describe the transmission of news. And I guess what I'm thinking of in response to your question, Jerry, is that the important institution here isn't the medium through which the news flows, but is the newsroom. And so there needs to be an economic model to defend the newsroom so that there can be a community of people with the same skills covering the news with certain goals in mind, like widespread transmission of information that's important in our communities. So if that sounds like newspapers, that's because newspapers were the news institution that historically took that role most seriously and that tended to set the agenda for everyone else. And to some degree they still do. And I mean, so it's all very well to have guys like me who write commentary that I think I filled a hole in the market. There's lots of people who agree with me and want to hear that commentary, but really I'm getting my story ideas for the most part from people doing the job that Miriam was doing until recently, writing and covering the news. So, you can't really get that on a consistent basis without a newsroom. So please don't understand, or don't come away with the understanding that I'm talking about putting money into running a physical newspaper, because I don't think that would be a good idea. But the transmission medium doesn't matter. The logical one at this point in history is somehow through the internet. But the institution of the newsroom is important to preserve.
Thank you for that question. All right, so that does it for us. Hope you enjoyed the rest of your day. Can we give a warm thank you to our panelists? And thank you for your questions.
Yeah, thank you, Chris, and thanks to both of you for being here. That was a really